Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, 5 massive lakes hold nearly 20% of the world's fresh surface water. Millions of people see them every year, but very few ever wonder what might be hidden beneath them. For generations, stories have circulated about strange underground tunnels, unexplained passages, and forgotten chambers buried beneath the Great Lakes. Some are linked to abandoned mines and natural cave systems. Others come from local legends, old maps, and accounts that have fueled speculation for decades. Could these stories point to a hidden network beneath North America's largest freshwater system? Or are they the result of myths that grew larger with every retelling? In this documentary, we'll examine the evidence, separate documented facts from folklore, and investigate the discoveries that continue to intrigue explorers, historians, and geologists alike. So, what really lies beneath the Great Lakes? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now start the story. Join me as we descend into one of North America's most fascinating underground mysteries, where every clue leads deeper, every theory raises new questions, and the truth may be far more surprising than fiction. There is something hidden beneath the Great Lakes that the standard history books never mention. Something that has rested in the pitch-black depths under billions of gallons of water, buried beneath centuries of sediment and profound silence, patiently waiting for someone to pose the correct questions. We have dispatched robotic explorers to the surface of Mars. We have charted the moon's terrain down to its smallest craters. Yet here, in the very heart of North America, under the planet's largest freshwater system, there are elements we simply cannot explain. Structures, winding corridors, and clear evidence of human hands shaping stone in ways that do not align with the accepted narrative of who inhabited this region and when. This presentation is dedicated to those very elements, to the tunnels, the hidden rooms, the geometric alignments, and the persistent individuals who continue to stumble upon them, only to be systematically overlooked. If you are listening to this to drift into slumber, that is precisely the purpose for which I create these narratives. Perhaps you might consider subscribing and letting me know in the comments where you are at this moment and what the clock says. Let's begin our journey with the water itself, because before we delve into what rests beneath the Great Lakes, we must first appreciate just how peculiar these bodies of water truly are. There are 5 of them: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Collectively, they hold approximately 1/5 of all the surface freshwater on the entire planet. Not just 1/5 of North America's water, but 1/5 of the entire world's surface freshwater. That statistic is nearly unfathomable. Lake Superior alone blankets over 31,000 square miles. It is so vast that it generates its own localized weather patterns. Mariners who have navigated its waters for decades will attest that Superior behaves less like an inland lake and more like a cold, capricious sea. Waves on Superior can swell to 25 feet or more. Vessels vanish there without a trace or explanation. The lake's floor is strewn with shipwrecks, some resting there for centuries. Yet, the crucial detail for our story is that these Great Lakes were not always lakes. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was drawing to a close. The immense Laurentide ice sheet, which had smothered much of North America under a mile or more glacial ice, was in retreat. As it receded, it left behind a transformed landscape, river valleys sculpted by glacial meltwater, plains stripped of their topsoil, and in the area we now identify as the Great Lakes Basin, enormous depressions began to fill with meltwater at a rate that would have been terrifying to observe. Before these lakes fully took shape, that basin was dry land, or at least partially dry, with rivers, forests, and the kind of ecosystems that could sustain human life. The ancestors of those we call Paleo-Indians were traversing that landscape. They hunted mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers the size of black bears, horses, and camels, animals that North American school children never learned existed here, because our modern imagination of the continent is so different. Those people were constructing things. They were establishing territories, trade networks, and sacred sites. Then, the water began to rise, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed. The lakes expanded, and the land vanished beneath them. Some of those sites, some of those structures, some of those sacred places were swallowed by the depths, and they have remained there ever since. The first significant modern encounter with the underwater enigma of the Great Lakes did not come from archaeologists, but from recreational divers. This point is important. The academic establishment has always had a complicated relationship with discoveries made by individuals outside the circle of credentialed experts. Throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, divers exploring the waters of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior began to return with stories that did not fit neatly into any of the things they had been taught. Stone walls resting at depths suggesting they were constructed when the water was absent. Circular arrangements of rocks that appeared deliberate, not random. Timber structures of immense age, preserved by the cold and the oxygen-depleted conditions at the bottom. Carved stones and shaped stones, the kind of things you only find a human hands place them there. The difficulty arose when these divers tried to report their findings. They encountered a wall. This wall was not necessarily one of hostility, but rather one of bureaucracy, funding structures, and the relentless momentum of academic consensus. To properly investigate an underwater archaeological site, you need permits, institutional backing, funding for equipment, dive support, and laboratory analysis. You need a university or a government agency willing to attach its name to the project. And in the 1970s and 80s, the institutional appetite for exploring the underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes was virtually non-existent. Some of those divers gave up. Others kept diving and continued to share their stories with anyone who would listen. A few maintained detailed notes and photographs. And eventually, those records found their way into the hands of people who recognized their potential significance. One of the first documented cases to receive any measure of sustained attention was located in Lake Michigan. In 2007, a research team from Northwestern Michigan University, while conducting an unrelated sonar survey of the lake bed, came across something they had not anticipated. At a depth of roughly 40 feet, in a region of the lake about 3 miles offshore from the town of Traverse City, the sonar images revealed what appeared to be a circular arrangement of stones roughly 40 feet in diameter. The stones were not enormous, mostly between 2 and 5 feet across, but they were organized with regularity that seemed distinctly non-natural. One of the researchers, Mark Hawley, personally dove to examine the formation. What he found has since become one of the most discussed and yet most poorly reported mysteries in American archaeology. The stones were arranged in a rough circle. That alone might not have been particularly noteworthy, as glacial activity can sometimes create circular patterns, and Great Lakes geologists encounter them with some frequency. However, inside the circle, on one of the larger stones, Hawley discovered a carving he described carefully, with appropriate scientific hedging, as possibly resembling a mastodon. The mastodon went extinct in North America roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. The implications of that, if the carving is genuine and if its identification is correct, are profound enough that you might wonder why this story isn't more widely known. The answer, as is often the case with the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America, is complicated. The site has never been fully excavated. It has never received the sustained scientific attention that would allow for definitive dating or interpretation. The academic response has ranged from cautious interest to polite dismissal. And in the absence of institutional support, the story has largely remained in the category of an interesting anomaly under investigation, but with no one holding their breath. Let's be clear about what is actually being suggested here. A carved stone, found at depth in an apparently intentional formation, depicting an animal that has not existed in North America for 10,000 years. If that is real, and there is no compelling reason to believe it is not, It means human beings were working this lakeshore when the lake was far lower than it is today. It implies there was a culture here, sophisticated enough to carve recognizable images into stone 10,000 years ago or more. And it means that culture left behind objects that ended up underwater when the lakes rose. Now, extend that logic outward. If there is one such site in Lake Michigan, how many might exist across all 5 lakes combined? To understand why the tunnels matter specifically, as opposed to simply underwater stone formations, you need to understand geology of the Great Lakes region. The basin rests atop some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet's surface. The Canadian Shield, which underlies much of the northern Great Lakes region, consists of Precambrian rock that, in some places, is more than 3 billion years old. 3 billion years old. That is older than the oldest multicellular life. That is rock formed before complex life existed on this planet. That ancient rock is riddled with natural fissures, fractures, and passages. Water has been moving through these passages for hundreds of millions of years, dissolving soluble rock, creating cavities and enlarging fractures into channels, building the kind of underground drainage systems that geologists classify as karst formations. The Great Lakes region is not typically described as karst country, but that description can be misleading. Beneath the glacial sediments in the ancient shield rock, there are extensive carbonate rock formations, limestone, dolomite, and gypsum beds that are highly susceptible to dissolution by slightly acidic groundwater. The Silurian and Devonian rock formations underlying much of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and the southern part of Ontario and Quebec are extensively karstified. There are known cave systems in this rock. There are known underground rivers. There are known sinkholes where the surface abruptly drops into void spaces below, what has not been systematically mapped. And this is the crux of the matter, is the full extent of these underground passages. The Great Lakes sit atop an underground world that is largely unexplored, not because it does not exist, but because a combination of water depth, sediment cover, and a lack of institutional interest has meant that no one has done the work required to map it. When researchers and divers began reporting passages, tunnels, and chambers beneath the lake floors and along the lakeshore cliffs, the standard response from the geological establishment was to attribute these features to natural karst processes. And in many cases, that attribution is probably correct. Natural cave systems exist throughout the region. The Niagara Escarpment, which runs through Ontario, New York, and Wisconsin, is full of natural caves and passages formed by the same dissolution processes that created Niagara Falls. Yet, some of the passages people have been finding do not appear natural, and that distinction matters enormously. A natural passage carved by water has certain characteristics. The walls are smooth in some places and rough in others, depending on how the rock fractured. The floor is uneven. The profile of the tunnel is irregular, shaped by the path of least resistance to the rock, rather than by any intentional design. Natural caves follow the geology, not a plan. A passage carved or modified by human hands looks different. The floor may be leveled. The walls may show tool marks, parallel striations left by stone or metal tools working the surface. The profile may be more regular, more deliberate. There may be features that have no geological explanation. Niches cut into the walls at regular intervals, carved symbols, what appear to be drainage channels, thresholds where the height of the passage changes in a planned manner. The reports coming out of the Great Lakes region for decades describe passages possessing these second characteristics. Passages in the limestone cliffs along the north shore of Lake Superior that show what appear to be cut stone blocks reinforcing natural cave openings. Chambers beneath the lake bed accessible through passages that are too regular in their dimensions to be natural water erosion. Tunnels in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that connect known archaeological sites on the surface to chambers that are now partially submerged. Let me be specific about one of these because the details are significant. In the 1990s, a group of amateur cavers working in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan discovered what they described as a modified natural passage in the limestone bedrock near the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore on the south shore of Lake Superior. The Pictured Rocks are one of the most visually spectacular geological formations in the Midwest, with towering cliffs of multicolored sandstone and limestone rising up to 200 feet above the lake. The cliffs are riddled with natural caves, arches, and passages carved by wave action and erosion over thousands of years. What the cavers found went beyond the well-known natural formations. They described a passage that began in a natural cave near the waterline and extended back into the cliff for several hundred feet. For the first portion of the passage, it appeared entirely natural, the kind of thing you expect in soluble rock near a large body of water. But further back, they claimed, the character of the passage changed. The walls showed evidence of tool work. The floor had been roughly leveled. In one section, they found what appeared to be stone blocks, not boulders deposited by glacial action, but shaped blocks, roughly rectangular, stacked in a way that resembled a retaining wall or a structural support. The passage eventually became too water-filled to continue, without diving equipment. What lay beyond the water, they could not reach. They reported their findings to the National Park Service. The response was polite and dismissive. The formations they described were likely natural. The apparent tool marks were probably glacial striations. The stone blocks were likely glacially deposited erratics. Case closed. Except the cavers were not convinced. And they were not alone. Throughout the same period, similar reports were emerging from other parts of the Great Lakes system. Along the eastern shore of Lake Huron on the Michigan side, divers were finding structures on the lake floor that did not fit any known geological model. The most significant of these was a network of what appeared to be low stone walls and platforms at a depth of between 20 and 40 feet, extending over an area of roughly a square mile. The walls were not tall, rarely more than 2 or 3 feet above the lake floor, but they were extensive and their arrangement suggested a purpose. Some researchers who examined photographs and sonar data from the site suggested the arrangement was consistent with a caribou hunting drive system. Paleo-Indian cultures throughout North America constructed elaborate systems of converging stone walls designed to funnel caribou herds toward killing grounds, making the hunt enormously more efficient. These systems are found throughout the Arctic and subarctic, built during the last ice age and the early post-glacial period. If the Lake Huron formations are indeed a hunting drive system, they were constructed when that portion of the lake floor was dry land, inhabited by caribou and the people who hunted them somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago. In 2009, a research team from the University of Michigan, led by archaeologist John O'Shea, conducted a systematic sonar survey of the northern Lake Huron basin. What they discovered was remarkable, even by the cautious standards of mainstream archaeology. The sonar data revealed extensive stone features on the lake floor, including what appeared to be a hunting wall, roughly 100 feet long, and a series of small enclosures or blinds where hunters could have concealed themselves. O'Shea's team also found a feature they called the Alpena Amberley Ridge, a now submerged landmass that would have connected Michigan to Ontario during the low water periods of the post-glacial era. Along that ridge, they found the stone features. O'Shea published his findings, and they received some attention in the scientific community and a brief burst of media coverage. Then the attention moved on, as attention does, and the structures on the floor of Lake Huron went back to being a curiosity rather than a priority. However, what the mainstream coverage almost entirely failed to address is this. If there are hunting walls and stone features that extensive on the floor of Lake Huron, built by people sophisticated enough to design complex cooperative hunting systems, what else did those people build? What happened to the rest of their material culture? Where are their settlements, their ceremonial sites, their burials? Where are the structures that represent the full scope of what these people made during the thousands of years they lived on that landscape before the water arrived? The hunting walls are impressive, But they are also, almost by definition, the kinds of structures you find at the edge of a landscape in the hunting grounds away from the main settlements. The settlements themselves, the places where these people lived and built and buried their dead and conducted their ceremonies, those who were inland on higher ground. And when the lakes rose, that ground went under. This brings us to the tunnels specifically, not the natural passages, not the hunting walls, but the tunnels themselves. The oldest oral traditions of the Anishinaabe people, the broad cultural and linguistic family that includes the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa nations who have lived around the Great Lakes for thousands of years, contain references to an underground world connected to the lakes. These traditions are not monolithic. They vary significantly between different Anishinaabe nations and different storytelling lineages, but certain themes recur with enough consistency that they deserve serious attention. One of those themes is the existence of passages beneath the earth that connect sacred sites. The Anishinaabe concept of the underworld is not simply a metaphorical or spiritual place in the way that some other cultural underworlds are presented. It is described in many of the traditions as a physical place with physical characteristics, a place you can enter and exit, a place with its own geography, a place where things exist that do not exist in the upper world. The passage into the underground world is described in some traditions as entering through the water, not simply diving beneath the surface, but entering through a specific place in the water where the boundary between the world above and the world below becomes permeable. And in those traditions, what lies on the other side of that boundary is not simply the lake floor, but a system of passages, chambers, and spaces that extend beneath the land itself. Now, traditions can be interpreted in many ways. Scholars of religion and oral literature would rightly point out that the Anishinaabe underworld traditions are rich symbolic and spiritual narratives that do not necessarily need to be taken as literal descriptions of physical geography. And that is true. Oral traditions operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Reducing a complex spiritual cosmology to a report about cave systems does violence to the traditions themselves. But the reverse is also true. Dismissing physical descriptions in oral traditions as purely metaphorical simply because they are inconvenient for the mainstream archaeological narrative is its own kind of intellectual error. When indigenous oral traditions describe specific places, specific geographic features, and specific events in ways that turn out to correspond to verifiable physical realities, the appropriate response is not to explain away the correspondence, but to take it seriously. The Anishinaabe traditions describe the underground world with enough geographic specificity that researchers have attempted to map the described passages against known geology. The results are not conclusive, partly because the traditions have not been systematically collected and compared, and partly because the geological mapping of the underground water systems beneath the Great Lakes is itself incomplete. But the correspondences that have been identified are interesting enough to warrant further investigation, which, as of yet, has not happened. There's a place called Mackinac Island. You may know it as a tourist destination, a small island in the straits between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, famous for its Victorian architecture and its prohibition on motor vehicles. Visitors arrive by ferry, rent bicycles, and tour the historic fort by fudge. It is one of the most genteel and civilized places in the American Midwest. It is also one of the most sacred places in the entire Great Lakes world. To the Anishinaabe, Mackinac Island is Michilimackinac, the place of the great turtle. The island's profile, rising steeply from the water, was seen as the back of a great turtle, the creature whose back supports the world in many North American creation traditions. The island was considered a gathering place for spirits, a site of enormous ceremonial importance, a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were unusually thin. The island is riddled with natural caves. The most famous is Skull Cave, a large natural cavern near the island's northeastern shore, named for human skulls that were found inside it by British soldiers during the colonial period. Those skulls have been attributed to various causes at various times, from massacre victims to ancient burials. But the full story of who put them there and when has never been satisfactorily resolved. Less well known than Skull Cave are the reports of passages beneath the island that extend beyond the cave openings visible on the surface. The limestone bedrock of Mackinac Island is classic karst territory, and natural passages are both expected and present. Yet, some of the passages described in historical accounts, both by European explorers and in Anishinaabe tradition, go further than simple natural caves. Jesuit missionaries who traveled to the Great Lakes region in the 17th century recorded in their relations references to underground passages beneath the island that the native inhabitants described as pathways used by the spirits. The missionaries, being 17th century Jesuits, interpreted these descriptions through their own framework, seeing evidence of devil worship in the reverence paid to underground places. But strip away the theological overlay, and you have European observers reporting indigenous descriptions of passages beneath Mackinac Island that were considered sacred and that extended beyond the known natural caves. In the 19th century, as tourists and settlers began to explore the island more thoroughly, additional cave openings were found, and some were explored. A few accounts from this period describe passages that extended for considerable distances before becoming too narrow or too flooded to continue. The island has not been systematically surveyed for its underground features. There is no comprehensive map of the passages beneath Mackinac Island. No one knows with certainty how far they go or what they connect to. Given the island's geological setting in a region of extensively karstified limestone, sitting in the straits between two of the largest lakes in the world, it would be extraordinary if there were not significant underground passages. The water pressure from the surrounding lakes alone would have driven extensive underground drainage. The question is not whether passages exist beneath Mackinac Island, but what those passages look like, how far they extend, and whether any of them show evidence of human modification. Those questions remain unanswered. Let's move north and west of the shore of Lake Superior, to a stretch of coastline that holds some of the most peculiar and most persistently ignored evidence in the entire Great Lakes mystery. The Keweenaw Peninsula juts out into Lake Superior from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, forming a narrow finger of land pointing northeast into the lake. The peninsula is famous among mining historians because it sits atop one of the most extraordinary copper deposits in the world. Not copper sulfides that require smelting, but native copper, pure metallic copper, some of it in masses of hundreds or even thousands of pounds, sitting in the rock waiting to be extracted. The mining history of the Keweenaw Peninsula that the textbooks tell is the story of the 19th century copper boom. The mines, smelters, and industrial operations that made Michigan copper briefly the most important mineral resource in the United States before the great copper deposits of Montana and Arizona were opened up. But there is an older mining history on the Keweenaw, much older, beginning in the late 19th century. As commercial miners pushed deeper into the Keweenaw deposits, they started finding things that did not belong in a geological sense. Stone tools, wooden implements, and structures of worked stone, the debris of a mining operation that predated any known historical or proto-historical culture in the region by a significant margin. The commercial miners and the geologists who worked with them were not naive about what they were finding. Some of them attempted to document what they discovered. Some of their reports made it into the geological and archaeological literature of the period, where they were duly noted, and then, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gradually buried under the accumulating weight of consensus that had decided the pre-Columbian copper mining of the region, though extensive, was the work of the woodland period cultures of the last 3,000 years or so. But the evidence did not fully support that consensus. The depths at which some of the artifacts were found, the geological context, the preservation state of organic materials, all of these factors pointed to ages significantly greater than the woodland period attribution allowed. Some of the wooden implements that were found preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the flooded mine workings were radiocarbon dated. When radiocarbon dating became available in the 20th century, to ages of between 5 and 7,000 years before present, 7,000 years ago, the civilizations we recognize as the first urban cultures of the ancient world had not yet built their first cities. Jericho had not yet been founded. The pyramids were more than 2,000 years in the future. And someone was working industrial-scale copper mines on the shore of Lake Superior. Where did all that copper go? This is a question that has generated significant scholarly controversy without generating a satisfying answer. The volume of copper extracted from the Keweenaw Peninsula and the surrounding Lake Superior copper country during the ancient mining period is enormous. Estimates based on the extent of the ancient workings suggest that somewhere between 1 and 500,000 tons of copper were removed from the Lake Superior copper country over the period of the ancient mining operation, which ran from roughly 5,000 to roughly 1,000 years before the present. That is an almost incomprehensible volume of material, 1 to 500,000 tons of pure native copper. You could build many things with that. You could trade it across a hemisphere and still have plenty left over. But where is it? The copper artifacts from the Hopewell and Woodland period cultures of the Midwest. The cultures that mainstream archaeology credits with the Lake Superior copper mining account for a fraction of that volume, a small fraction. There is a gap of enormous scale between how much copper was removed from the Lake Superior mines and how much copper has been accounted for in the archaeological record of North American cultures. Some researchers have proposed that the missing copper was traded south and east through the vast trade networks that connected pre-Columbian North America to Mesoamerica and beyond. That hypothesis is intriguing and has generated some interesting supporting evidence, but it has never been fully substantiated. Others have proposed that some of the copper went in other directions entirely, west and north, and possibly in ways that the conventional story of ancient North America does not account for. For our purposes, what matters most about the Keweenaw copper mystery is what it implies about the scale and sophistication of the civilization or civilizations that were doing the mining. 5 to 7,000-year-old industrial mining operations do not happen spontaneously. They require organization, technology, supply chains, transportation networks, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. They require a civilization of significant complexity. And complex civilizations build things. They build structures, shelters, ceremonial sites, storage facilities, and yes, tunnels. The mining operations themselves would have required extensive underground work. Some of the ancient copper workings found on the Keweenaw have passages that descend to considerable depths. Not all those passages have been fully explored or mapped. Some of them are flooded. Some of them intersect with natural karst passages in the underlying limestone, and some of them, according to the accounts of miners who encountered them in the 19th century, led to chambers and passages that extended well beyond the limits of the copper deposits being worked. In the summer of 1865, a mining engineer named Samuel Knapp was conducting an assessment of a copper mine on the Keweenaw Peninsula when his team broke through into a pre-existing void space at a depth of about 90 feet. What they found on the other side of the breakthrough was reported in the mining journals of the period and has been referenced by researchers periodically ever since, without ever receiving the systematic investigation it deserves. Knapp described a passage roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet high, running in a roughly east-northeast direction, with walls that showed evidence of both natural formation and human modification. The floor of the passage had been leveled. The walls in certain sections showed what he described as dressing, the smoothing of rough rock surfaces to create more regular walls. At intervals, he noted what appeared to be niches cut into the walls at approximately chest height. The passage continued beyond the reach of his lanterns. His team followed it for approximately 200 feet before the passage became too low and too wet to continue safely. They did not return. The mine was eventually abandoned, not for lack of copper, but for lack of financing and the location of the breakthrough passage was not precisely recorded in a way that would allow later researchers to find it again with confidence. Knapp's account is not unique. Similar descriptions appear in other mining records from the Keweenaw and from a broader Lake Superior copper country throughout the latter half of the 19th century. They are frustrating documents to work with because they are inconsistent, poorly referenced, and sometimes, frankly, sensationalized. The mining booster culture of the period was not above embellishing a good story to attract investment capital. But when you discount the clearly embellished accounts and look at what remains, there is a persistent pattern of underground passages in the Keweenaw copper country that extend beyond the known ancient mining works, and that show characteristics suggesting they were not entirely of natural origin. Moving further west along the south shore of Lake Superior, we come to the Apostle Islands. 22 islands scattered across a 25-mile stretch of lake just off the Bayfield Peninsula in northern Wisconsin. The islands are now a national lakeshore administered by the National Park Service, and they are genuinely beautiful, some of the most spectacular scenery in the upper Midwest. The brownstone sea caves along the mainland shore and on several of the islands are particularly extraordinary. Massive caverns carved by centuries of wave action into the reddish-brown Precambrian sandstone. The sea caves are natural. Nobody disputes that. The wave action that carved them is ongoing, and you can watch it happening during the late autumn storms when Lake Superior builds to its most violent state. But there are passages in the Apostle Islands that are not sea caves. Passages that begin in the sea caves and continue back into the rock beyond the reach of the waves. Passages that have been explored by divers who enter them through underwater openings that are only accessible when the lake level is right. Passages that in some accounts connect islands that are separated by open water. The geology of the Apostle Islands region includes extensive carbonate rock formations beneath the sandstone formations that are susceptible to dissolution and karstification. The islands themselves sit on a geological structure called the Lake Superior syncline, a basin-shaped feature in the underlying rock that was formed by the weight of glaciers and by tectonic processes operating over millions of years. The syncline contains rock formations that are known to be extensively fractured and that, given the right conditions, could easily develop substantial underground drainage systems. In the Ojibwe oral traditions of the region, the Apostle Islands are considered deeply sacred, associated with Manitous, the spirit beings that inhabit natural places, and with events in the spiritual and physical history of the Anishinaabe people that stretch back to the beginning of human presence in the region. Madeline Island, the largest of the Apostle Islands, known in Ojibwe as Muningwanakaning, was a center of Ojibwe culture for centuries and is still considered by many Ojibwe people as the heart of their homeland. In the oral traditions associated with Madeline Island and the surrounding archipelago, there are references to passages beneath the islands and beneath the lake floor that connect the islands to each other and to the mainland. These passages appear in contexts that are explicitly sacred, described as pathways used by spiritual practitioners and by beings that are not entirely human. The traditions do not describe these passages as purely spiritual or metaphorical. They describe them as physical spaces with physical characteristics. European missionaries and explorers who worked in the region from the 17th century onward recorded references to these underground passages, again to the distorting lens of their own cultural frameworks. The Jesuit relations contain at least 3 separate references to underground passages in the Lake Superior region, described to the missionaries by their indigenous informants. The missionaries interpreted these references as descriptions of the devil's domain, which tells you something about their interpretive framework, and nothing reliable about the actual nature of what their informants were describing. Later European observers were somewhat more empirical. A French-Canadian fur trader named Jean-Baptiste Cadot, who lived among the Ojibwe on Madeline Island in the mid-18th century and whose descendants became prominent in Great Lakes history, left accounts of ceremonies he witnessed on the island that took place in connection with passages into the earth. Cadot was not a credulous man. He was a pragmatic trader who spent decades working in extremely challenging conditions, and he was not given a supernatural interpretation. His accounts describe physical spaces, physical practices, physical ceremonies conducted in locations that he understood to be underground. Predate's accounts are not well known outside of a small community of regional historians. They have not been systematically analyzed in the context of the broader Great Lakes underground mystery. They deserve to be one of the most intriguing and most poorly documented pieces of the Great Lakes tunnel puzzle. Comes not from the lake shores, but from the lake floor itself. In the late 1990s, a commercial fisherman working the waters of Lake Michigan in the region south of the Straits of Mackinac made a report to state authorities that was recorded, filed, and effectively ignored. The fisherman, whose name I will withhold because he is asked not to be publicly identified in connection with this story, had lowered his sonar equipment into water roughly 150 feet deep when it produced a return that he could not explain. Not the undulating soft return you get from sediment, not the hard flat return you get from bedrock, but something in between, an irregular, suggesting void space beneath the lake floor. He noted the coordinates in the readings and reported them to the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, which has jurisdiction over the lake's resources within state waters. The DNR logged the report, filed it, and took no further action. Budget constraints, competing priorities, and the low status of anything that sounds like fringe archaeology in a resource management bureaucracy. These things are real. The fishermen went back to the same location several times over the following years, and each time, the sonar produced the same ambiguous return void space, or something that behaved like void space beneath the lake floor and water that was itself 150 feet deep. He kept notes. He kept the coordinates. Eventually, he shared both with a researcher at a university who was working on Great Lakes geology, not archaeology, but geology. The geologist looked at the data and said something that surprised the fisherman. The sonar returns were consistent with what you would expect from a significant void space in karstified limestone, a cave. In other words, a cave 150 feet below the surface of Lake Michigan, beneath an additional unknown depth of lake floor sediment and bedrock. The geologist noted the location. She mentioned it to colleagues. It generated some conversation. No one applied for funding to investigate further. The file went into a drawer. This is the pattern repeated over and over across the Great Lakes. Anomalous data reported to authorities, filing and forgetting, occasional professional attention, insufficient follow-through, and the mystery, instead of being resolved, simply accumulates more data points. Let's talk about what some researchers are calling the grid. Beginning in the early 2000s, a small group of researchers working independently of each other, using a combination of satellite imagery, sonar data, published geological surveys, and historical records, began to notice something strange about the distribution of known anomalies in the Great Lakes region. The anomalies, which included the stone formations on the lake floors, the reported underground passages, the ancient mining sites, and locations of certain known archaeological sites on the surface, were not randomly distributed. They seemed to align not perfectly, not with precision of a modern engineering survey, but with consistency that began to look, to those paying attention, like evidence of intentional placement rather than random occurrence. The alignments they identified ran along several axes. Some of them followed geological features, fault lines, the edges of Canadian Shield, the boundaries of the major carbonate rock formations. That kind of alignment is expected and unremarkable. Natural features align with geology because geology shapes the landscape, and cultures that interact closely with the landscape will naturally position their important sites in relation to natural features. But other alignments cut across the geological features, connecting sites that had no obvious geological connection, but that showed up at regular intervals along lines that tracked the positions of certain celestial objects at specific times of year. Solstice alignments, equinox alignments, the kind of astronomical orientations that appear in the monumental architecture of cultures around the world, and that are generally understood as evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge and intentional placement. The researchers who identified these alignments were careful in their published work to acknowledge the difference between patterns that could be coincidental and patterns that could not. The sample size available to them was small. Many of the data points they were working with were poorly documented. The possibility of confirmation bias, of seeing pattern because you were looking for pattern, had to be taken seriously. But the alignments they identified were consistent enough, and the number of data points that fit them was large enough that they concluded the pattern deserved serious investigation. Not proof of anything specific, but evidence of something worth investigating. That investigation has not happened. Not institutionally, not with the resources and the systematic approach that would allow for definitive conclusions. What has happened is that the pattern has been noted, discussed in alternative archaeology circles, dismissed or ignored in mainstream academic circles, and left to sit unresolved, accumulating additional data points as new anomalies are reported. The mystery of the Great Lakes tunnels connects to a broader question that is fundamental to our understanding of pre-Columbian North America. That question is this: who was here before the people we know about? The mainstream narrative of North American prehistory has been revised many times in the last 50 years, and it continues to be revised. The Clovis first model, the idea that the first human to enter the Americas came across the Bering Land Bridge 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly south and east, populating the continent in a matter of a few thousand years, has been fundamentally challenged by evidence from sites across North and South America that demonstrate human presence significantly earlier than Clovis technology allows. The Monte Verde site in Chile has been reliably dated to at least 14,600 years before present, and possibly as early as 18,500 years. That means people were in the southern tip of South America before the ice-free corridor through Alaska and Western Canada even opened up. They had to have gotten there some other way, most likely by boat along the Pacific coast, navigating ice-free refugia along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia. That means there were coastal peoples in the Americas at least 14,000 years ago, probably significantly earlier, with maritime technology sufficient to make long-range coastal journeys. Other sites in North America have produced evidence of human presence at ages well beyond the Clovis threshold. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania have produced dates as early as 16,000 years before present. The Paisley Caves in Oregon have produced human DNA from coprolites dated to over 14,300 years before present. The Bluefish Caves in Yukon have produced evidence of butchered animal bones that may date to as early as 24,000 years before present. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence is of a human presence in the Americas that is much older, much more complex, and much more geographically diverse than the Clovis first model allowed. The Americas, it now appears, were entered multiple times by multiple populations coming from multiple directions over a period of time that may span 20,000 years or more. And the cultures that developed from those multiple founding populations were far more diverse, far more sophisticated, and far more interconnected than conventional narrative suggests. What does this mean for the Great Lakes? It means that when we think about who built the stone formations on the lake floors, who modified the passages beneath the Keweenaw Peninsula, who maintained the sacred underground spaces described in Anishinaabe oral tradition, we cannot assume those people were the cultural ancestors of the known historic tribes of the region, or that their civilization was at the level of complexity that the conventional archaeological sequence assigns to the early Holocene of the Great Lakes Basin. We are, in all likelihood, dealing with the remnants of a cultural sequence that is far older, far more complex, and far less well understood than the textbook suggests. The tunnels, if they exist, and if they were made by human hands, are not the work of primitive hunter-gatherers scratching in the rock for shelter. They are the work of a civilization that had been in place long enough to develop the organizational capacity for major construction projects, the astronomical knowledge reflected in possible site alignments, and the spiritual and ceremonial traditions preserved in fragmentary form in the oral traditions of their successors. That civilization went under, literally, when the Great Lakes rose to their current levels. The landscape that civilization had inhabited disappeared beneath the water. What remains of it is down there in the dark, at depth, waiting to be found. The question of how to find it is not simple, and the obstacles are not merely logistical. There is a political dimension to underwater archaeology in the Great Lakes that any honest account of the subject has to address. The Great Lakes sit on the traditional territories of multiple indigenous nations. The Anishinaabe nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and others all have ancestral connections to different parts of the Great Lakes Basin and different relationships to the archaeological and cultural heritage of the region. Those nations have legal rights recognized in federal law and in numerous treaties over the cultural heritage of their ancestral territories. Those rights extend under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and related legislation to cultural materials found on federal land, including federal waters. The underwater archaeological sites of the Great Lakes, to the extent that they fall within federal jurisdiction, are subject to this legal framework. Any systematic investigation of those sites would require meaningful consultation with and consent from the relevant indigenous nations. This is not an obstacle to investigation. It is a necessary component of any investigation that is going to be conducted responsibly and that is going to be scientifically credible. Indigenous oral traditions and indigenous knowledge of the landscape are among the most valuable resources available to researchers investigating the pre-Columbian history of the Great Lakes. Any investigation that attempts to proceed without that knowledge, or that treats it as secondary to other forms of evidence, is going to miss things and get things wrong. The complication is that not all indigenous communities want the sites investigated in the way that academic archaeologists will want to investigate them. For some communities, the underground places and the underwater structures are not archaeological resources waiting to be studied. They are sacred sites whose sanctity depends partly on their remaining inaccessible and undisturbed. The tension between the academic imperative to document and analyze and the indigenous imperative to protect and preserve is real, and it is not easily resolved. This tension has been a significant factor in the failure of the Great Lakes Tunnel mystery to receive the sustained institutional attention that would allow for definitive investigation. Any researcher who approaches this material without grappling seriously with that tension is not taking the full picture seriously. Let's go deeper into the oral traditions because they contain details that become more interesting the closer you look at them. The Ojibwe Miwewin, the Grand Medicine Society, is one of the oldest living ceremonial traditions in North America. Its origins are described in the Miwewin oral tradition as lying in a time of crisis, a time when the Anishinaabe people were facing devastation, and a great Manitou, a spiritual being, came to the people and gave them the knowledge of the Miwewin as a means of healing and spiritual renewal. The Miwewin ceremony involves multiple levels or degrees of initiation, each associated with specific knowledge, specific powers, and specific responsibilities. The knowledge transmitted in the higher degrees of the Miwewin includes, according to practitioners who have spoken publicly about aspects of the tradition, information about the sacred geography of the Anishinaabe homeland, including the locations and nature of sacred underground places. The most authoritative published source on the Miwewin is probably the work of Walter James Hoffman, an ethnologist who conducted extensive field work among the Ojibwe in the late 19th century and whose 1891 report to the Bureau of American Ethnology, the Miwewin, or Grand Medicine Society of the Ojibwe, remains the most comprehensive academic account of the tradition. Hoffman's work has significant limitations, most notably the limitations imposed by his cultural position as a 19th century white American government ethnologist, but it contains detailed descriptions of Miwewin knowledge and practice that have proven remarkably consistent with later accounts. In Hoffman's account, The Midway knowledge includes references to a system of sacred places connected by underground passages. These are described not as metaphorical connections, but as physical passages that can be traversed by those with the appropriate knowledge and spiritual preparation. The passages are associated with specific water bodies, specifically with the Great Lakes and with the major rivers that flow into them, and they are described as extending considerable distances beneath the earth. Hoffman, being a 19th century ethnologist, was uncertain what to make of these descriptions, and he basically filed them under the category of mythology. Later researchers working in the Midway tradition have taken them more seriously, but the academic literature on the subject remains thin. What is significant for our purposes is that the Midway tradition describes the underground passages in ways that are specific enough to be testable, not in every detail, and not in ways that would allow someone unfamiliar with the tradition to go digging in the right place and find things, but in ways that, combined with the geological and archaeological evidence we have been discussing, begin to sketch the outlines of a coherent picture. The picture is of a landscape, now largely submerged, that was not only inhabited but extensively modified by human cultures over a period of thousands of years. Those modifications included not just the surface structures, the stone walls and platforms and earthworks that are the most archaeologically visible, but underground modifications, passages and chambers created by combining natural karst features with human excavation and construction, used for purposes that were both practical and ceremonial. When the lakes rose, those underground features went partly underwater, partly under sediment, and partly remain accessible through openings that are now hidden beneath the lake's surface or disguised by centuries of geological change. And the memory of those features, the knowledge of where they were and what they were used for, was preserved in oral tradition by the cultural successors of the people who built them. The shoreline of Lake Erie holds a different kind of puzzle. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, with an average depth of only about 62 feet, and it is also the southernmost, sitting in a climate zone that supported dense human settlement in the pre-Columbian period. The people who lived around Lake Erie in the centuries before European contact included the Erie Nation, whose name the Europeans attached to the lake, as well as Iroquoian-speaking peoples, and, earlier, the cultures of the Hopewell tradition and their predecessors. The Hopewell tradition is one of the most fascinating chapters in pre-Columbian North American history, and one of the least well understood, centered primarily in the Ohio River Valley, but extending its influence across a vast area of eastern North America from roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago. The Hopewell culture built extraordinary earthworks, maintained trade networks that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf Coast, and achieved artistic and ceremonial sophistication that has few parallels in the pre-agricultural world. The Hopewell earthworks of Ohio, the great enclosures and burial mounds of Newark and Chillicothe, and a dozen other sites, are among the most extraordinary archaeological monuments in North America. Some of them are geometrically precise, at a scale that challenges explanation. The Newark earthworks in Licking County, Ohio, cover an area of roughly 4 square miles and include circles, octagons, and other geometric forms that have been shown by archaeologist Brad Lepper and others to align with the movement of the moon over its 18.6-year cycle. To construct a monument of that complexity and geometric precision, using nothing but human labor and simple tools required a level of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that is genuinely impressive by any standard. The Ohio Hopewell Centers are roughly 150 miles south of Lake Erie, but the Hopewell trade networks extended to the lake shore and beyond. Hopewell artifacts have been found throughout the Lake Erie Basin, and the lake itself would have been an important transportation corridor for the long-distance trade that was the economic foundation of Hopewell civilization. Here is what connects the Hopewell to the tunnel mystery. The Hopewell earthworks are not just earthworks. Some of them contain passages. Underground chambers access through precisely constructed earth passages, oriented with apparent astronomical intent, used for burial and ceremony, but also, some researchers believe, for other purposes not fully understood. The Hopewell burial chambers in Ohio are relatively well studied, as such things go. Their astronomical orientations are documented. Their contents have been excavated and analyzed. They are within the mainstream archaeological framework, reasonably well explained as elaborate mortuary monuments. But there are features associated with Hopewell sites that are not well explained. Underground passages that extend beyond the burial chambers themselves. Passages that connect separate earthwork structures. Passages that, in some cases, extend beyond the known boundaries of the earthwork complexes and continue in directions that have not been fully traced. At the Newark Earthworks, the site that has probably received the most intensive recent study, there is a feature sometimes called the Great Hopewell Road, a pair of parallel earthen walls extending from the main earthwork complex in a remarkably straight line toward the southwest, in the direction of a cluster of other Hopewell sites roughly 60 miles away. Lepper, who has studied the road extensively, has proposed that it may have connected Newark to Chillicothe, two of the largest Hopewell centers in Ohio, as part of the ceremonial landscape that integrated multiple major sites. The road is a surface feature, not an underground passage, but it is associated with underground features at both ends. And some researchers have proposed that it functioned as part of a system that integrated above-ground and below-ground movement in ways that the surface archaeology alone does not fully reveal. If there were underground passages connecting Hopewell sites in Ohio, and if the Hopewell trade networks extended to Lake Erie, the next question is obvious. Did those underground systems extend toward the lake? And if they did, what happened to them when the lake level changed? Lake Erie's level has fluctuated significantly over the post-glacial period. During the low water phases of the early post-glacial era, the lake was much smaller and shallower than it is today, and significant areas of land that are now lake bed were exposed. During those phases, human settlement would have extended into what is now the lake, and any underground features building connection with those settlements would now be submerged. The shoreline archaeology of Lake Erie is, relatively speaking, better studied than that of the other Great Lakes, largely because of the lake's shallow depth and the accessibility of the nearshore zone. There have been underwater surveys along parts of the Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York shores. Some of them have found evidence of submerged settlements, stone features, cultural materials, and organic remains. The evidence is consistent with what you would expect if people were living on what is now the lake floor. What those surveys have not systematically addressed is the question of underground features associated with the submerged settlements. That question remains open. There's a site in Ontario on the north shore of Lake Erie near the town of Port Dover that deserves more attention than it gets. In the early 1980s, a local amateur archaeologist named David Weimer began investigating reports from farmers in the area of unusual stone features exposed during plowing. What he found over several seasons of surface survey was evidence of a site of considerable extent, with stone features including what appear to be sections of worked stone walls and a concentration of cultural materials suggesting long-term occupation. More interesting than the surface features was what Weimer found when he investigated a natural slope at the edge of property where erosion had cut into the underlying limestone bedrock. There, partially exposed by the erosion, was what appeared to be a passage entrance cut into the rock. The passage was roughly 4 feet wide and about 5 feet high, with walls that showed clear evidence of tool work. It extended back into the hillside for about 30 feet, before it became too low and too debris-filled to continue. Weimer photographed the passage and reported it to the Ontario Ministry of Culture. The ministry sent an inspector who confirmed the existence of the passage and its apparently artificial character, but noted that no cultural materials had been found inside it, and that it could not be definitively dated without excavation, without datable cultural materials. The inspector said there was no basis for heritage protection or further investigation. Weimer was disappointed, but not deterred. Over the following years, He corresponded with researchers at the University of Toronto and at several American universities, attempting to generate institutional interest in the site. The responses were politely interested and practically inert. No one came to investigate. No funding materialized. Weimer eventually stopped writing about the site, though his notes and photographs are preserved and have been consulted by later researchers. The site at Port Dover is not unique. Similar reports from rural southern Ontario and from the Ontario shore of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario surface periodically in local historical societies and in the records of amateur archaeologists who lack the institutional resources to pursue them further. They are, in the aggregate, a body of evidence that mainstream archaeology has not engaged with seriously. Moving north and east, we reach the territory of one of the most intriguing and most suppressed stories in the entire Great Lakes mystery, the mystery of the copper tablets. In 1890, a farmer named James Scotford, working near the small town of Edmore in central Michigan, discovered what he claimed were a series of copper tablets inscribed with symbols he could not identify. He found them while digging in a mound on his property, one of the thousands of earthen mounds scattered across Michigan that have the most visible legacy of the Hopewell and related cultures. The tablets generated immediate controversy. They were examined by scholars who disagreed sharply about their authenticity and about the nature of the inscriptions. Some claimed the inscriptions were meaningless, arguing that Scotford had fabricated them. Others identified elements in the inscriptions that they compared to various ancient scripts, including Hebrew, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and the characters of the Meskwaki people, an indigenous nation whose historical records are fragmentary. The controversy over the Michigan copper tablets became one of the most acrimonious in 19th century American archaeology, entangled with questions of religion, politics, and the racial ideologies of the period. The tablets eventually became associated with claims about ancient Jewish or Hebrew presence in pre-Columbian North America, claims that were enthusiastically promoted by some, particularly in certain religious communities, and equally vigorously dismissed by the academic establishment. The academic dismissal was probably correct in specific cases. Some of the tablets that circulated in the late 19th century were clearly fabricated. The entrepreneurial culture of the period produced a steady stream of archaeological fakes aimed at satisfying the public appetite for exciting pre-Columbian discoveries, and the Michigan tablets were almost certainly contaminated by forgeries. But the presence of forgeries in a collection does not necessarily mean that all the items in the collection are fake. And the question of whether any genuine inscribed copper objects were found in Michigan mounds in the late 19th century has never been satisfactorily resolved. What connects the copper tablet controversy to the tunnel mystery is this. Some of the mounds in which the tablets were reportedly found were associated with passages. Not elaborate tunnel systems, just passages, short underground sections connecting the mound chambers. Those passages have not been systematically investigated. Some of the mounds in which they were found have since been destroyed by agriculture or development. Others survive but have not been excavated under modern archaeological standards. The connection between the copper tablet mounds and the broader underground mystery of the Great Lakes is speculative, but the concentration of anomalous finds, inscribed copper, underground passages, evidence of sophisticated material culture in a region that mainstream archaeology assigns to cultures that should not have been capable of producing them, is a pattern worth noting. We should talk about the divers because the divers are where the most recent and in some ways the most compelling evidence has come from. And because the stories of what happens to divers who get too close to certain underwater anomalies are among the strangest parts of this entire mystery. Sport diving in the Great Lakes is a significant recreational activity. The cold, clear waters, especially in the northern lakes, offer excellent visibility, and the thousands of shipwrecks on the lake floors make the Great Lakes one of the premier wreck diving destinations in the world. There is an active community of Great Lakes divers, well organized, well connected, and with decades of institutional memory about what the lake floors look like. Within that community, there has been for at least 40 years a subculture of divers who are specifically interested in the lake floors beyond the wrecks. Divers who are looking for geological anomalies, for unusual formations, for evidence of pre-Columbian occupation. This is a minority of the diving community, treated with varying degrees of respect and skepticism by the mainstream diving culture, but persistent and in aggregate, accumulating a significant body of observational data. Some of those divers have described experiences that go beyond simple underwater exploration, experiences that have convinced them that something about certain underwater sites in the Great Lakes is actively unusual. A diver who was asked to be identified only by a first name, Kenneth, described to a researcher in 2014 his experiences diving a site in northern Lake Huron that he had been visiting periodically for several years. The site, which Ken declined to specify precisely, contained what he described as a passage in the lake floor, an opening in the rock at about 60 feet of depth that he estimated at roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet high. He had entered the passage several times and had followed it for what he estimated as several hundred feet before turning back. He described the passage as having the characteristics of a modified natural cave, with sections of clearly natural water-carved rock alternating with sections that showed what he interpreted as deliberate shaping. What Kenneth described beyond the simple physical characteristics was more difficult to evaluate. He reported a strong sense of disorientation in certain sections of the passage, a loss of the normal sense of direction that experienced cave divers sometimes describe as an effect of confined space, and a difficulty of reading the visual cues that normally keep spatial orientation intact. He also reported that his dive computer had given anomalous readings at certain points in the passage, reading depths inconsistent with his GPS position and estimated location within the passage. Kenneth acknowledged that both of these experiences had conventional explanations. Disorientation in confined underwater passages is well documented and psychologically well understood. Anomalous depth gauge readings in caves can result from changes in water pressure associated with flow dynamics in the cave system. He was not claiming anything supernatural. He was describing experiences that were unusual enough to remain with him, and that he had reported to other divers who had visited the same site and described similar experiences. What he was most insistent about in the account he gave to the researcher was the physical reality of the passage itself. He was a trained, experienced cave diver with hundreds of dives in his log. He knew what modified passages looked like, and he knew what natural caves looked like, and what he had found in Lake Huron was something that combined both characteristics in a way that was not consistent with any natural process he could identify. His description of the passage in its broad outlines is consistent with a dozen other diver accounts from different parts of the Great Lakes over the past 4 decades. Passages in the lake floor that are partly natural and partly modified. Passages at depth suggesting they were built when the lake was lower. Passages that continue further than the diver was prepared to follow. None of those accounts has generated a systematic investigation. None of them has been written up in a peer-reviewed journal. They exist in the gray zone between documented evidence and anecdote, which is exactly where the entire Great Lakes tunnel mystery has always lived. What would it take to actually resolve this mystery? Not partially, not provisionally, but definitively. First, it would take a systematic sonar survey of the Great Lakes floor, not the partial surveys that have been conducted for navigation and resource management purposes, but a high-resolution survey specifically designed to identify anomalous features, void spaces, and structures of potential archaeological significance. The technology to do this exists and has existed for decades. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam sonar, sub-bottom profilers that can see beneath the sediment layer the features in the underlying rock. These are all well-developed technologies routinely used in offshore oil and gas exploration and in oceanographic research. Their application to the shallow waters of the Great Lakes would be entirely feasible. The estimated cost of a comprehensive, high-resolution survey of the Great Lakes floor, all 5 lakes, has been put by various researchers at somewhere between $50 and $100 million over a period of several years. That is a significant investment. It is also a fraction of what is routinely spent on less consequential research programs in the natural sciences. Whether the investment would be justified depends on what you think is likely to be found. And that question is determined partly by your assessment of the evidence discussed in this video, which mainstream archaeology tends to discount, and partly by the potential significance of what a major discovery would mean for the understanding of North American prehistory. Second, it would take a systematic program of underwater archaeological investigation at the anomalous sites already identified. The stone formations on the floor of Lake Huron, the sonar anomalies in Lake Michigan, the sites reported by divers in Lake Superior and elsewhere. These sites need to be documented, dated, and analyzed according to modern archaeological standards. That requires trained underwater archaeologists, specialized equipment, institutional support, and, crucially, meaningful consultation with the indigenous communities whose cultural heritage is connected to these sites. Third, it would take a systematic review of the historical and archival record, the mining reports from the Keweenaw Peninsula, the Jesuit relations, the account of fur traders and missionaries and explorers who reported underground passages in the Great Lakes region, the 19th century amateur archaeological literature, the oral historical records preserved by indigenous communities. All of this material needs to be systematically collected, analyzed, and compared against each other and against the physical evidence. Fourth, and perhaps most controversially, it would take a willingness on the part of the mainstream archaeological establishment to take the anomaly seriously rather than defaulting to dismissal. This is not simply a request to lower scientific standards. It is a request to apply scientific standards consistently. The anomalous evidence from the Great Lakes deserves the same rigorous investigation that will be applied to anomalous evidence from any other region of the world. The fact that it is in North America, and that taking it seriously challenges a comfortable narrative about pre-Columbian North American history, should not be an excuse for applying a lower standard of investigation. There is a current of thought in the academic community and in the broader culture that treats interest in ancient mysteries and anomalous archaeology as inherently suspect. The connection between fringe archaeological thinking and conspiracy culture, between ancient mystery enthusiasts and bad faith actors using pseudo-history to push political agendas, is real, and it has poisoned the well for serious inquiry. When mainstream archaeologists dismiss anomalous evidence without engaging with it seriously, part of their motivation is entirely understandable. They do not want to lend credibility to people who are using the fringe of archaeology to advance racist theories about pre-Columbian North America. Those racist theories are real, and they are pernicious. The history of American archaeology includes a deeply ugly strand of thought that attributed the mounds, the earthworks, the sophisticated material culture of pre-Columbian North America to anyone except the actual indigenous people who built them. The mound builder myth, the idea that there was a separate, more advanced civilization that built the earthworks and was then displaced or destroyed by the ancestors of the modern indigenous peoples, was weaponized in the 19th century to justify the dispossession and genocide of those peoples. If the original inhabitants were themselves conquerors who displaced a more worthy civilization, the logic went, then what was being done to them was merely history repeating itself. That myth has been comprehensively debunked by modern archaeology. The Hopewell earthworks, the Mississippian platform mounds, the Cahokia complex, all the major pre-Columbian monumental architecture in North America was built by the cultural ancestors of modern indigenous peoples. There is no evidence for a separate mound race. There is no mystery about who built these things in the sense that was implied by the mound builder mythology. But debunking a specific race's misuse of anomalous archaeology does not mean that all anomalous archaeology is racist misuse. It does not mean that everything about pre-Columbian North American history is now fully understood. It does not mean that the evidence of very early human presence in the Great Lakes region, the underwater stone formations, the ancient copper mines, the modified passages, should be dismissed without investigation simply because some people would use it badly. The appropriate response to the possibility that pre-Columbian North American history is more complex, more ancient, and more mysterious than the current consensus allows is not to stop investigating. It is to investigate carefully, rigorously, and in partnership with the indigenous communities whose heritage is at stake. The mystery of the Great Lakes tunnels is ultimately a mystery about time, about how long human beings have been in North America, and what they built during all those thousands of years that came before the historical record begins. We know from the available evidence that people have been living around the Great Lakes for at least 10,000 years, and probably significantly longer. We know that during much of that time, the lake floors were dry land inhabited and modified by those people. We know that the lakes rose and submerged much of that landscape, taking with it the material evidence of thousands of years of human activity. We know that the oral traditions of the peoples who lived through that transition, or whose ancestors did, preserve memories of what that submerged landscape contained, including underground passages that were used for purposes both practical and sacred. We know that modern researchers using modern technology and modern investigative methods have found evidence consistent with those oral traditions, anomalous features on the lake floors and along the lake shores that do not fit simple geological explanations and that suggest the work of human hands. And we know that the systematic investigation required to resolve this mystery definitively has not been undertaken for a complex combination of logistical, financial, political, and institutional reasons. What we do not know is what will be found if that investigation were conducted. What structures, what passages, what evidence of civilization or civilizations older than the conventional timeline allows lie under the cold, dark water of the Great Lakes waiting to be discovered. We do not know how far the tunnels go. We do not know what they connect. We do not know who built them or precisely when or precisely why. We do not know if the correspondences between the oral traditions and the physical evidence are coincidental, or if they are, as the traditions themselves claim, evidence of genuine preserved knowledge about the real physical geography of a submerged world. We do not know if the astronomical alignments identified by researchers represent genuine intentional placement by people with sophisticated astronomical knowledge, or they are patterns imposed by selection bias on evidence that is too sparse and too poorly documented to support such interpretations. What we do know is that the mystery is real, not as conspiracy theory, not as fringe pseudo-history, not as ancient astronaut speculation, but as a genuine unresolved question in the archaeology, geology, and indigenous history of one of the most extraordinary natural landscapes on Earth. The Great Lakes are the heart of the North American continent in more ways than the obvious one. They are not just a vast reservoir of fresh water. They are, if the evidence we have been discussing is to be taken seriously, the surface expression of a much deeper story. A story about people who lived and built and dreamed here for thousands of years before the water came. A story about what they left behind. And a story about how little of that legacy we have yet bothered to find. The deeper you go into this subject, the more connections you find. Not the sensational connections of conspiracy theory. Not the claimed connections to Atlantis or ancient Egypt or extraterrestrial contact, but the genuine evidence-based connections that speak to complexity of a human past in North America. Consider the network of rivers that flow into the Great Lakes. The St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, the French, the Mattawa, the Severn, the rivers of southern Ontario highlands, the rivers of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the rivers of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. For thousands of years, these rivers were not just waterways. They were highways, trade routes, the circulatory system of a civilization that is invisible to us because most of its traces are now underwater or under sediment or under the accumulated weight of a historical narrative that was not designed to accommodate it. The birch bark canoe routes of the historic fur trade era followed paths that had been in use for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. The trade networks that moved Hopewell copper from Lake Superior to the Gulf Coast, that moved obsidian from Wyoming to Ohio, that moved marine shells from the Atlantic coast to the interior heartland. These networks required infrastructure, not necessarily infrastructure in the modern sense of roads and bridges, but infrastructure in the deeper sense of known routes, established portages, reliable stopping points, and the accumulated knowledge of how to navigate a vast and varied landscape. Some of that infrastructure was above ground. Some of it, the evidence suggests, was below. The tradition of using underground spaces as waypoints, storage facilities, and ceremonial sites is not unique to the Great Lakes. IT appears across the archaeological record of North America, from the kivas of the Southwest to the Earth Lodge traditions of the plains to the subterranean storage pits found at sites throughout the woodland East. The idea that people who lived around the Great Lakes would have used underground spaces, both natural and modified, as part of their daily and ceremonial life is entirely consistent with a broader North American pattern. What is distinctive about the Great Lakes situation is the scale and the submergence. The scale of the lake system itself means that the amount of landscape that went underwater when the lakes rose was enormous, and the depth and the preservation conditions in the cold, dark, and Noxic lake waters mean that what went under may have been preserved far better than equivalent surface features from the same period. This is, if you think about it, a remarkable opportunity. Most of the pre-Columbian North American archaeological record has been exposed to 10,000 years of weathering, agriculture, erosion, and development. The quality of preservation is, for the most part, poor. Organic materials rarely survive. Structures that were not built of stone leave only the faintest traces in the soil. The underwater sites in the Great Lakes, by contrast, may have been preserved in conditions that are extraordinarily favorable to the survival of organic materials. Wooden structures, textiles, cordage, the kind of evidence that almost never survive in surface archaeological contexts. The cold water, the low oxygen, the absence of the biological activity that on land destroys organic matter in decades or centuries. All of these factors mean that what is down there may be preserved in a state of completeness that is simply not achievable for surface sites of comparable age. This is why the failure to systematically investigate the underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes is not just an academic oversight. It is potentially an irreversible loss. The sediment continues to accumulate. The biological and chemical conditions of the lake floor, already disturbed by modern shipping, agricultural runoff, and invasive species, continue to change. There may be a window of time during which the preserved evidence of thousands of years of human activity can still be found and documented. That window is not unlimited. The story of the Great Lakes tunnels is not finished. It may, in a certain sense, be just beginning. The technology required to investigate the lake floor seriously is now available and affordable in ways it was not even 20 years ago. Autonomous underwater vehicles capable of conducting systematic sonar surveys without putting divers at risk. Remotely operated vehicles that can explore confined spaces and recover samples. Portable radiocarbon dating methods that can provide preliminary dates in the field. Photogrammetry techniques that can create three-dimensional maps of underwater structures from diver-held cameras. The scientific and archaeological community is slowly, very slowly, becoming more receptive to the possibility that the conventional timeline of North American prehistory is significantly wrong. The accumulation of evidence from sites like Monte Verde, Meadowcroft, and the Paisley Caves has been sufficient to dislodge the Clovis First consensus and open space for a more complex and more ancient understanding of human presence in the Americas. The indigenous communities of the Great Lakes region are more organized, more legally empowered, and more engaged with the academic community than they have been at any point in the post-contact era. The frameworks for meaningful collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities have been developed. Imperfectly but genuinely. In the decades since the passage of NAGPRA, the public interest in the genuine mysteries of pre-Columbian North American history is real and is growing. The success of serious popular treatments of subjects like the Hopewell earthworks, the Cahokia complex, and the ancient copper trade demonstrates that there is an appetite for this material that goes beyond sensationalism, and that is not satisfied by either dismissal or conspiracy theory. All of these factors create conditions under which a serious, sustained, collaborative investigation of the underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes might actually happen. Not certainly, not even probably, given the institutional inertia and the funding constraints that have shaped this field for decades. But possibly, and if it does happen, what might be found? At the most conservative end of the spectrum of possibilities, such an investigation would likely document extensive submerged cultural landscapes in all 5 lakes, hunting walls, campsites, extraction sites, and possibly settlement sites dating to the period between 8 and 12,000 years before present, when the lake levels were significantly lower. That alone would be a major contribution to the understanding of early North American prehistory. At the more ambitious end of the spectrum, it might find evidence of underground structures, modified passages and chambers that document a level of architectural complexity and organizational sophistication in the early post-glacial cultures of the Great Lakes region that goes well beyond what current models predict. It might find evidence that the sacred underground geography described in Anishinaabe oral traditions corresponds to physical realities that have been preserved under the lake waters for thousands of years. At the most extraordinary end of the spectrum, the end that cannot be ruled out, but that cannot be confidently predicted, it might find evidence of civilization or civilizations in the Great Lakes Basin that are older, more complex, and more significant than anything currently imagined. In the mainstream archaeological account of North American prehistory, that a civilization that built things intended to last, underground things in the most permanent geological medium available that have been sitting in the dark beneath the lakes, waiting for thousands of years for someone to ask the right questions. The cold, dark water of Lake Superior is about 3 degrees Celsius at depth in midsummer, cold enough to kill an unprotected diver in minutes. Cold enough to preserve organic materials for thousands of years. Cold enough to slow every biological process to near stasis, keeping things intact that would have rotted away millennia ago if they had been left in the open air. Down there, below the shipping lanes and the tourist ferries and the sport fishing boats, below the wave-churned surface zone where the light reaches and the warm spreads out from the summer sun. It is dark, and it is still, and it is cold. Something is down there. That much we can say with confidence. The sonar anomalies, the diver reports, the geological analysis of the karst formations beneath the lake floors, the oral traditions of the people who have lived around these lakes for longer than history records, all of these point to the same conclusion. There are features in the underground world of the Great Lakes that have not been explained. Whether those features are the remnants of civilization, the evidence of a cultural sequence far older and far more complex than the textbooks allow, or whether they are simply geological curiosities that have been misinterpreted by people seeking more than the geology can support, that question cannot be answered until someone goes down there and looks properly. The mystery is down there in the dark, and the most honest thing that can be said about it is that we do not know. We do not yet know what it is, or how old it is, or who made it, or what it means. We only know that it is there, and that the story of how it got there is one of the oldest stories on this continent. Maybe the oldest one we have not yet learned to read. If you made it this far into the night, into this quiet corner of mystery that most people never find, thank you for following the story down into the dark alongside the divers and the researchers and the oral historians who have been trying to tell it for decades without quite being heard. The Great Lakes keep their secrets well. Billions of gallons of cold water are a remarkably effective filing system for things that were not meant to be forgotten, but have been anyway. Whatever lies beneath those lakes, whatever passages connect, whatever chambers rest in whatever darkness under that enormous weight of water, it has been waiting for this long. It can wait a little longer, but not forever. Nothing waits forever. If this story kept you up or helped you drift off into whatever dreams the deep water brings, consider subscribing. More stories like this one are waiting. Stories about the things that are hidden in plain sight, the mysteries that are real rather than invented, the questions that matter, because the answers would change everything. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is, what the night looks like where you are. Someone in Duluth, maybe with a lake a few blocks away. Someone in Thunder Bay with Superior right outside. Someone far from the lakes entirely. Listening to this in a place where the nearest water is a faucet. Imagining what it would be like to stand on the shore of one of those cold inland seas and look out over the water and know, or at least suspect, that something extraordinary lies beneath. Rest well. The mystery will still be there in the morning. It always is. Let's go back even further. Because one of the things that makes the Great Lakes tunnel mystery genuinely unsettling to those who spend real time with the evidence is that the deeper you dig, both literally and figuratively, the older the story gets. And an older story means a more complex civilization. A more complex civilization means more things built. More things built means more things waiting to be found. The conventional story assigns the Great Lakes copper mining tradition to a period beginning roughly 5,000 years ago and ending roughly 1,000 years before the present. That is the old copper complex, as archaeologists call it, a cultural tradition defined by its use of native copper from the lake's superior deposits to manufacture tools, weapons, and ornaments of exceptional quality. The old copper complex produced some of the most technically sophisticated metalwork in the pre-agricultural world. Socketed spear points, knives with beveled edges, fish hooks, awls, gouges, and a range of other implements whose designs anticipated the forms that human toolmakers would independently reinvent in metal cultures around the world. But the old copper complex itself was not the beginning of copper working in the Great Lakes. The copper deposits of the Keweenaw Peninsula have been known and used for much longer. The question is how much longer. Radiocarbon dates from the deepest levels of some of the ancient mining sites on the Keweenaw have returned ages that push the beginning of copper extraction back to 7,000, 8,000, possibly even 9,000 years before the present. At those ages, the civilization doing extracting was older than the pyramids by a very large margin. It was older than any city we know of by name. It was operating at the very beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch we live in, when the last glaciers were still retreating from the northern parts of the continent. What was that civilization doing with all that copper? The old copper complex artifacts that archaeologists have documented account for a fraction of what was removed from the lake's superior deposits, even accounting for considerable losses to corrosion over thousands of years. The arithmetic does not work. Too much copper was taken out. Not enough copper has been found in the archaeological record of North American cultures. Some researchers have spent years pursuing this discrepancy, following the copper, as they put it, trying to trace where the hundreds of thousands of tons of extracted metal actually went. And the trails they have followed lead, in some cases, to places that mainstream archaeology finds uncomfortable. There is a cluster of Bronze Age sites in the eastern Mediterranean dating to roughly 3,500 to 1,200 years before the present that have produced copper artifacts with a distinctive isotopic signature. Isotopic analysis of copper artifacts can identify the geological source of the copper used to make them, the same way that isotopic analysis of human bones can identify where a person grew up. The isotopic signature of copper from different deposits is distinctive enough to be used as a fingerprint. Some of the copper in Mediterranean Bronze Age sites, a fraction, but a significant fraction, has an isotopic signature consistent with Lake Superior copper rather than with the known copper deposits of the Mediterranean world, Cyprus, Sardinia, the Iberian Peninsula. This finding, which has been reported in the peer-reviewed literature, and which has been dismissed, accepted, debated, and essentially left unresolved for decades, would imply, if correct, that there was a transatlantic copper trade in the Bronze Age. That implication is, to put it mildly, not welcome in mainstream archaeology. A transatlantic copper trade between the Great Lakes and the Mediterranean would require a level of maritime capability in the Bronze Age that is not consistent with current models of ancient seafaring. It would require regular contact between civilizations on opposite sides of the Atlantic, contact that has left apparently almost no other evidence. But not quite none. The question of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact is one of the most contentious in all of archaeology, tangled up with political and religious agendas, with a long history of wishful thinking and outright fraud, and with a very real and very serious problem of motivated reasoning on all sides. This is not the place to try to resolve that question, and it is not a question that needs to be resolved to make the Great Lakes Tunnel mystery significant. The mystery is significant regardless of what happened to the copper. But the copper question is relevant because it speaks to the scale and the sophistication of the civilization that was working the lake's superior mines. A civilization sophisticated enough to export copper to the eastern Mediterranean, if that is what happened, was sophisticated enough to build extensively and deliberately underground. A civilization that operated at that scale for thousands of years left things behind. And what it left behind is in large part in the Great Lakes. Let's slow down here because this specific point deserves more time than it usually gets. When we talk about civilizations leaving things behind, we tend to think about the visible things, the monuments, the earthworks, the artifacts in museum cases. We think about what survived on the surface because the surface is where we look. But civilizations do not only build on the surface, they build underground when the underground serves a purpose. And for a copper mining civilization operating at industrial scale over thousands of years, the underground served many purposes. Storage, protection from the extreme weather of the Lake Superior Basin, where winter temperatures can drop to 40 below zero and storms can pin a camp for weeks. Transportation corridors that allowed movement without exposure to the open landscape. Ceremonial spaces separated from a noise and light of surface life. And the mines themselves, which started as surface pits and trenches, and over centuries became deep workings that required genuine underground engineering. The scale of the ancient copper workings on the Keweenaw has to be understood in terms of the landscape they created. These were not small diggings. They were, in aggregate, among the largest ancient mining operations anywhere in the world at the time they were active. The Isle Royale copper deposits on the island in the middle of Lake Superior show ancient workings covering hundreds of acres. The Keweenaw mainland deposits show similar extents, and the methods used, the combination of fire setting to fracture rock, cold water quenching to exploit thermal stress, and heavy stone mauls to break the fractured rock and extract the copper, required sophisticated organization and considerable physical infrastructure. Where did the miners sleep? Where did they store their food through the long working season? Where did they keep their tools and their processed copper before it was moved to transport canoes? These are questions that surface archaeology struggles to answer because the surface evidence has been so thoroughly disturbed. First by the natural processes of 10,000 years of post-glacial weathering and vegetation change, and then by the industrial copper mining of the 19th century, which tore apart vast sections of the Keweenaw landscape in pursuit of ore that had no value to the ancient miners, but was the whole point for the 19th century operations. What the industrial mining could not fully destroy was what was underground. The passages and chambers that the ancient miners created in the course of their work, and the natural caves and passages they modified and used, are still there in many cases because the industrial mining mostly followed different ore bodies and different geological formations. The ancient workings targeted the native copper in the amygdaloidal basalts and the conglomerate formations of the Keweenaw sequence. The industrial mining worked the same formations but pushed them to depths and at scales that the ancient miners never attempted. And in doing so, it bypassed much of the shallow ancient workings, leaving them intact, flooded, and largely unexplored. The ones that have been explored briefly and inadequately suggest that the underground world of the ancient Keweenaw miners was more extensive and more structured than is generally acknowledged. There are reports from 19th century miners and engineers whose work occasionally intersected with ancient workings at moderate depth of chambers that could not have been formed purely as a byproduct of copper extraction. Spaces that were too large and too regular to be explained as the widened voids left by removing copper masses. Spaces that suggested to men who found them deliberate construction rather than incidental extraction. One of the most detailed of these reports comes from an 1857 survey of ancient workings near Eagle River on the Keweenaw. A mining engineer named Horatio Graves described in his survey report a void space at roughly 60 feet below the current surface that he estimated at 30 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 8 to 10 feet high. The walls of the space showed evidence of both natural geological formation and human modification. In his description, a combination of water-etched rock in the lower portions and what appear to be deliberately leveled and smooth surfaces in the upper portions. The floor of the space had been partially cleared and roughly leveled. In one corner, he found what he described as a stone-lined pit, approximately 3 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep, the purpose of which he could not determine. Graves filed his report, noted the location, and moved on to the economic assessment he had been hired to provide. The space he described was not economically interesting. There was no copper in it, so it received no further attention. That report has been cited periodically by researchers interested in the ancient copper culture, always in the context of acknowledging that such spaces exist, and then moving on to other questions. It has never been the subject of a dedicated investigation. The location Graves described, cross-referenced with the available historical maps of the Keweenaw, corresponds to an area that was subsequently worked by industrial miners and then largely reclaimed by forests. Whether the space he described still exists and can be relocated is unknown. There is a related and equally neglected body of evidence from a completely different part of Great Lakes. The Sanilac petroglyphs in Michigan's Thumb region, on the east side of the lower peninsula near the shore of Lake Huron, are one of the most significant and most underpublicized prehistoric rock art sites in North America. Carved into a sandstone outcrop along a tributary of the Cass River, the petroglyphs include images of deer, birds, a solar symbol, a bow hunter, and a series of abstract geometric forms. They were first documented by archaeologists in the 1970s and are now a state historic site. What is less often discussed in the popular accounts of the Sanilac petroglyphs is the context in which they were made and what that context implies about the people who made them. The sandstone outcrop at Sanilac sits in a landscape that was, in the post-glacial period, a dynamic and frequently flooded river delta. The Cass River system drains into Saginaw Bay, the large southwestern arm of Lake Huron, and the delta region has been subject to repeated cycles of flooding and sediment deposition throughout the Holocene. The petroglyphs were made at a specific moment in that landscape's history, carved when the water was low enough to expose the sandstone, and then covered by subsequent flooding and sediment deposition before being re-exposed in the 19th century by forest fires. The people who made these carvings were not making them in isolation. The Saginaw Bay region of Lake Huron has one of the densest concentrations of known archaeological sites in the Great Lakes Basin, reflecting thousands of years of intensive human use of a landscape rich in fish, waterfowl, wild rice, and plant foods. And in that densely occupied landscape, there are underground features, natural and modified, that have not been systematically studied. The connection between the petroglyphs and the underground features in the same landscape is speculative, but both represent aspects of the same cultural tradition, a tradition of people who lived intimately with the specific geography of the Lake Huron shoreline and who expressed their relationship to that geography in both surface and subsurface ways. Understanding one without the other is like reading every other chapter of a book and assuming you have the whole story. The Sanilac site also raises a question that applies to the entire Great Lakes rock art tradition. How much more is there that has not been found yet? The known petroglyphs and pictographs of the Great Lakes region are almost certainly a fraction of what was originally made. Sandstone weathers. Cliff faces collapse into the lake. Rock surfaces that were carved when they were above the waterline are now submerged. The underwater rock art of the Great Lakes is a category that has barely been considered, let alone systematically investigated. One diver working the cliff faces along the north shore of Lake Superior in the early 1990s reported photographing what appear to be carved symbols on a submerged rock face at about 20 feet of depth near a known pictograph site. The symbols from her photographs looked similar in style to the above-water pictographs at the same location, but were simpler in form, possibly older or possibly representing a different phase of the same tradition. She reported the find to the Ontario Ministry of Culture, which logged it and took no further action. The photographs are in a box somewhere. The location is in her dive log. The story is one more thread in the same fraying rope that connects all the scattered evidence of the Great Lakes underground mystery. Real, documented, imperfect, neglected, waiting. There is a layer of the mystery that sits at the intersection of geology and deep time that most popular treatments of the subject skip over, because it requires thinking about geological processes in ways that are not intuitive, and that do not fit neatly into either the standard archaeological narrative or the alternative archaeology narrative. The Great Lakes Basin has been shaped not just by the glaciers of the last ice age, but by geological events stretching back billions of years. The Canadian Shield, the ancient Precambrian rock that underlies the northern Great Lakes region, is one of the most geologically stable pieces of crust on the planet. It has not been significantly deformed by tectonic activity in more than 1 billion years. It is, in geological terms, almost incomprehensibly old and almost incomprehensibly stable. But beneath the shield and around its edges, the geological history is more complex. The Mid-Continent Rift System, a feature that runs along the southern margin of the shield through Lake Superior and down into Kansas, represents a failed attempt by the North American continent to split apart about 1,100,000,000 years ago. The rift produced enormous volcanic outpourings that are the source of the Lake Superior copper deposits, as well as a series of basaltic and other igneous formations that have been extensively fractured and modified by subsequent geological processes. The rift was followed, hundreds of millions of years later, by the deposition of the Paleozoic carbonate rocks, the limestone, dolomite, and gypsum formations that underlie the southern Great Lakes region. Those carbonates were deposited in warm, shallow tropical seas that covered the region during the Silurian and Devonian periods, roughly 400 to 500 million years ago. The fossils preserved in those rocks, corals and crinoids and brachiopods, are the remnants of a world so different from the present that it requires a real effort of imagination to connect them to the landscape you can see today. And it is those carbonate rocks that are the geological foundation of the tunnel mystery, because carbonates dissolve. Water made slightly acidic by dissolved carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and from soil organic matter dissolves limestone and dolomite over thousands and millions of years. That dissolution creates voids in the rock, passages and chambers, and entire underground drainage systems. The process is slow but relentless. And in regions of thick carbonate rock with significant groundwater flow, it can create extensive cave systems of extraordinary complexity. The Paleozoic carbonate rocks beneath the southern Great Lakes, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and the southern Ontario lands are thick, extensively fractured by the weight of the glaciers and by the geological movements of the past billion years, and have been subject to groundwater flow for millions of years. The conditions for extensive karst development are ideal. The known caves in the region, commercial caves like Crystal Cave in Ohio and the various show caves in Michigan, are the visible expressions of a much larger underground drainage system that has not been fully mapped. Now add to this geological foundation the specific conditions created by the Great Lakes themselves. The lakes sit on top of this karstic limestone, and the pressure gradient between the lake water and the groundwater in the underlying rock creates specific flow patterns that both dissolve the rock in some places and deposit material in others. Springs emerge along the lake floors where groundwater, under pressure, pushes up through the limestone. Sinkholes open where the roof of a dissolved cavity collapses. The dynamic is complex and ongoing, not a static geological feature, but an active underground hydraulic system. Into this system, over the course of thousands of years, human beings have been inserting themselves, exploring, modifying, using. The natural caves were the entry points. The natural passages were the starting places. What happened inside those natural features, and how far the human modification extended beyond the natural features, is the core of the mystery. One of the researchers who has spent the most time with the physical evidence of the Great Lakes underground is a geologist who is asked to remain anonymous in public accounts of this material. He has worked in the region for 30 years, initially for a state geological survey, and more recently on his own time with a small group of collaborators. Over those 30 years, he has compiled a database of what he calls anomalous underground features in the Great Lakes Basin, features that do not fit the standard geological explanations and that he believes represent in some cases evidence of human modification of natural cave systems. His database, which he has shared with researchers he trusts and which is circulated in limited form in the alternative archaeology community, contains documentation of more than 200 separate sites distributed across all 5 lakes and their surrounding drainage basins. The documentation is variable in quality, ranging from detailed reports with photographs and measurements to brief notes based on second-hand accounts. But the aggregate, he argues, is significant. The sites fall into several categories. There are modified cave entrances, natural openings in cliff faces or in the lake floor that show evidence of enlargement or regularization by human hands. There are interior passages that transition from natural cave morphology to what appears to be deliberate excavation. There are chambers that are too regular in their dimensions to be natural dissolution features. And there are what he calls connecting features, passages that appear to link natural cave systems that, in a purely geological analysis, would not be expected to connect. The connecting features are the most significant in his view because they are the hardest to explain as anything other than deliberate human construction. Natural cave systems develop along geological pathways, following fractures and dissolving zones in the rock. 2 separate cave systems in a region of karst rock may be physically close to each other, but they developed along different fracture patterns. They will not naturally connect. If you find a passage connecting them, and that passage shows characteristics of artificial construction rather than natural dissolution, you have strong evidence of human tunneling. He has identified what he believes are 3 separate instances of this pattern in the Great Lakes region. One in the Niagara Escarpment in Ontario, one in the karst terrain of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and one in the carbonate formations of the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin. In each case, he argues, 2 natural cave systems are connected by a passage that he interprets as artificial. His interpretations have not been published in peer-reviewed form for reasons that are partly methodological and partly political. The methodological issues are real. His documentation, while extensive, does not meet the standards required for archaeological publication. The political issues are equally real. Publishing a claim that ancient underground passages exist in the Great Lakes region would expose him to professional consequences that he, as a working geologist with institutional affiliations, is not willing to accept. This is a pattern. One more pattern in a long list of patterns that recurs throughout the study of Great Lakes anomalies. The people who find the things that do not fit the consensus narrative have strong incentives to stay quiet about them and very little institutional support if they choose to speak up. The geologist who compiled the database is not a crank. He is a careful, credentialed professional who has spent 30 years looking at rock and believes that what is found cannot be fully explained by natural geological processes alone, that he may be wrong. Confirmation bias is a real risk in any long-term investigation driven by a specific hypothesis. But he may also be right, and the failure to take his evidence seriously enough to investigate it properly is a failure of the scientific process, as much as it is a personal frustration for him. There is a smaller mystery nested inside the larger one that deserves its own examination. The mystery of the Menominee. The Menominee are one of the original peoples of the Great Lakes region, with a homeland centered on what is now northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Their oral traditions place their origin in the Great Lakes country at a time before memory, connecting their history to the landscape of the lakes and rivers and forests in ways that go back far beyond any historical record. In the Menominee oral traditions, there is a specific and detailed account of an underground world connected to the Great Lakes. The underground world is not described in the same terms as in Anishinaabe cosmology, though the Menominee and the Anishinaabe share the broader cultural sphere of the Great Lakes Algonquian peoples, and their cosmological traditions overlap in significant ways. What is distinctive in the Menominee account is a specific geography, a set of physical descriptions of underground places that have enough specificity to be compared against actual geological features. A Menominee scholar and cultural historian named Vera Fowler, who served as president of the College of Menominee Nation and who has written extensively on Menominee history and culture, described in one of her published accounts a set of oral traditions about underground passages beneath the Menominee River and its tributaries that connect to the Great Lakes system. She was careful to present these traditions as part of Menominee spiritual and cultural knowledge, rather than as literal geographical description, and she explicitly noted that the tradition should not be used to support archaeological investigation without the consent of the Menominee Nation. But in the same account, she noted that the physical descriptions and traditions, the details about the character and dimensions of the underground spaces, the descriptions of water movements and stone formations, were consistent with geological features in the Menominee homeland that she had personally observed. She was not making a strong claim. She was noting a correspondence. But her noting of that correspondence, coming from a position of cultural authority and scholarly credibility, is significant. The Menominee River system drains a region of northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that sits on the boundary between the ancient Precambrian shield rock to the north and the Paleozoic carbonates to the south. That boundary zone is geologically complex and has been subject to extensive underground drainage. Known caves in the region include some of the deepest in the Great Lakes Basin, and the Menominee oral traditions describe underground passages in exactly this zone. The correspondence may be coincidental, but given the general pattern of correspondence between oral traditions and physical evidence throughout the Great Lakes underground mystery, it is at minimum worth taking seriously. And taking it seriously means, again, exactly what it has meant throughout this discussion: systematic investigation that has not been done. The question of who specifically built the passages, if they were built, is one that the evidence does not fully answer, and that the oral traditions address in ways that are difficult to translate directly into archaeological categories. The oral traditions of the Anishinaabe, the Menominee, and other Great Lakes peoples do not generally describe the underground passages as the work of their own direct ancestors. They describe them as older than that, as features of the landscape that were there when the earliest Anishinaabe came to the Great Lakes country. They are associated with beings that are not fully human in the traditions, with the Manitous and the Memagwezi, the small hairy beings who live in the rocks and who are sometimes described as the original workers of stone. The Memagwezi are one of the most intriguing figures in Anishinaabe tradition. They appear in the traditions of multiple Anishinaabe nations, usually described as small, roughly human-shaped beings that live in rocky places, particularly in cliff faces and along river and lake shores. They are said to be enormously skilled with stone, capable of moving through rock as easily as through air. They are associated with petroglyphs and pictographs, the rock art that appears throughout the Anishinaabe homeland, some of it of very great age. They are neither fully benevolent nor fully malevolent in the traditions. They are other, separate from humanity, connected to the deep time of the landscape rather than to human history. Some researchers have proposed that the Memagwizi traditions preserve a cultural memory of an earlier human population, people who lived in the Great Lakes region before the ancestors of the modern Anishinaabe, and who were encountered over a long period of coexistence by the incoming Anishinaabe. In this interpretation, the rock paintings and the underground passages are the physical legacy of that earlier population, preserved in the landscape and attributed in oral tradition to beings who are described as non-human precisely because they were so different from the people who followed them. This interpretation is speculative. It rests on an analogy with traditions from other parts of the world where oral traditions of small, non-human stone workers have been proposed as memories of earlier populations. And those analogies are themselves controversial. But it represents an approach to the Great Lakes underground mystery that takes seriously both the physical evidence and the oral traditions and tries to find a coherent account that incorporates both. If there were people in the Great Lakes region before the Anishinaabe and before the known archaeological cultures of the region, people who built the passages that are attributed to the Memagwizi, who were they? Where did they come from? When did they live? And where did they go? These questions do not have answers. Not yet. But the fact that they can be asked and that there is real evidence, physical and traditional, that warrants asking them means that the Great Lakes Tunnel mystery is not simply a collection of geological curiosities and underfunded archaeology. It is a window into a depth of human history in North America that we have barely begun to look through. Some of the most compelling evidence for human presence in the Great Lakes region at ages far exceeding the conventional timeline comes not from underwater sites, but from above-ground sites that have been poorly investigated or actively suppressed. The garden beds of Michigan are one example. Scattered across the lower peninsula of Michigan, particularly in the southwestern counties near Lake Michigan, are hundreds of raised earth garden beds, elongated ridges of soil that were first noticed by European settlers in the early 19th century and attributed to the prehistoric agricultural practices of the local indigenous peoples. The beds are real. They are visible in some locations today as subtle features in the landscape, but their age and their cultural attribution are more complex than the simple account suggests. Some of the garden beds in southwestern Michigan have been dated, where dating is possible, to ages that are consistent with the Hopewell or Woodland period cultural sequence of the last 2,000 years. That attribution makes sense, and is probably correct for many of the beds. But other beds, particularly those in locations that have been less disturbed by agriculture and development, show characteristics that suggest greater age, deeper soil profile development, more extensive root cast patterns in the ridges, suggesting that significant trees grew on the ridges before the forest that was present when Europeans arrived, and evidence of multiple phases of construction and modification extending over a much longer period. And some of the garden bed complexes in southwestern Michigan are associated with underground features. Not tunnels exactly, but passages, short underground sections connecting elevated mounds and ridges, sometimes aligned in ways that suggest astronomical orientation. These underground connections have been documented in a few cases and ignored in others. The relationship between the garden beds and the broader Great Lakes underground mystery is not direct. The beds are agricultural features, not tunnels, but they are evidence of a long-term, sophisticated landscape modification program in a region that sits between the Great Lakes and the broader Midwest. And they are associated with underground features that suggest the people who made them were comfortable working both above and below the surface. The mystery of the Great Lakes tunnels is a mystery that lives to a significant degree in the gap between what is known and what is acknowledged. What is known in the sense of documented and evidenced is considerably more than what is acknowledged in the mainstream scientific and archaeological literature. What is known includes the sonar anomalies in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron that suggest void spaces beneath the lake floors. The modified cave passages reported by divers and cavers along the shores of Lake Superior, Huron, and Erie. The ancient mining works of the Keweenaw Peninsula and their underground extensions beyond the copper deposits. The oral traditions of the Anishinaabe, Menominee, and other Great Lakes peoples describing underground passages and chambers connected to the lake system. The stone formations on the floor of Lake Huron documented by the University of Michigan research team. The correspondence between geological karst features in the region and the physical descriptions in oral traditions. The astronomical alignments identified in the distribution of known archaeological sites and anomalous features. The historical reports of underground passages from European observers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The gap between the volume of copper extracted from the Lake Superior mines and the volume accounted for in the archaeological record of North American cultures. Each of these pieces of evidence is imperfect in isolation. Sonar anomalies can have natural explanations. Dive reports are subjective and unverified. Mining records from the 19th century are incomplete and sometimes unreliable. Oral traditions operate on multiple levels and do not translate straightforwardly into archaeological evidence. Astronomical alignments can be artifacts of selection bias. Historical reports are filtered through cultural frameworks that distort the underlying reality, but the aggregate is harder to dismiss. When you have multiple independent lines of evidence coming from different sources, using different methods pointing in the same general direction, the appropriate scientific response is not to dismiss the aggregate, because each individual piece is imperfect. It is to recognize that an imperfect but converging body of evidence constitutes a genuine scientific problem, requiring systematic investigation. The Great Lakes Tunnel mystery is a genuine scientific problem. It requires a systematic investigation it has not received. The reasons it has not received that investigation are a combination of funding constraints, institutional inertia, the political sensitivity of pre-Columbian North American history, and the distorting effects of the fringe culture that has attached itself to the subject and made serious researchers hesitant to engage with it. None of those reasons is sufficient justification for continued neglect of a question of the significance. There is a moment in the accounts of almost everyone who is seriously engaged with this mystery when the scale of what might be down there becomes viscerally real. When the abstract discussion of sonar anomalies in archaeology and oral traditions crystallizes into an actual image of an actual place in the actual dark beneath an actual lake, that moment is different for different people. For some researchers, it is the moment when the sonar data first shows a distinctive return pattern of a void space in the lake floor, and they realize they're looking at a cave that no one has mapped, that may be larger than anything they have imagined, that may contain evidence no one has seen in thousands of years. For divers, it is often the moment when they enter a passage in the lake floor and realize 10 feet in, 20 feet in, that the passage continues further than they can see with their dive lights, that it is not a pocket cave or a dead-end fissure, but a real passage leading somewhere genuinely unknown. For researchers working with oral traditions, it is sometimes a moment when a detail in a traditional account matches a specific geological feature with a precision that is hard to attribute to coincidence. For all of them, the moment has the same quality, a sudden vertiginous sense of just how much there is that we do not know, of how much has been sitting in the dark, waiting for so much longer than we thought. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater system on Earth. They have been here in something like their current form for roughly 10,000 years. And human beings have been here on their shores and in their waters and in the rock beneath them for all those 10,000 years and more. What those human beings built, what they left behind, what the cold, dark water has been keeping for us, we are only beginning to imagine. The investigation, when it finally happens, will be one of the most significant archaeological undertakings in the history of North American science. The tunnels await, the mystery endures, and somewhere at depth in the dark, in the cold, something that was made by human hands 10,000 years ago is still exactly where it was left, waiting for someone to find it. There is one more thread worth pulling before we let the dark water close over this story. The thread that connects the physical mystery to the question of what it means for the people alive today. Not just the researchers, not just the indigenous communities, but all of us who live on this continent and who have some stake in understanding where we actually come from. North America has a deep history, not just the European colonial history that fills the textbooks, not just the civilizations of Mexico and Peru that receive grudging acknowledgement in the standard narrative because their monuments are too large to pretend did not exist. The whole continent has a deep history. Thousands of years of human civilization, sophisticated and complex and diverse, that lived and built and traded and thought and dreamed here before the first European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. That history is not well known. It is not well known because it has not been well investigated. And it has not been well investigated partly because of the damage done by the racist pseudo-history of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which so thoroughly poisoned the well that serious researchers became reluctant to engage with anything that suggested the pre-Columbian history of North America was more complex than conventional story allowed. And the conventional story has real virtues. It is not fundamentally dishonest. The archaeology it describes is real. The cultures it documents were real and impressive, and deserve the serious attention they have received. The Hopewell earthworks are genuinely remarkable. The Cahokia complex is genuinely extraordinary. The old copper complex metalwork is genuinely sophisticated. The conventional story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is a story worth knowing and worth celebrating, but it is also almost certainly incomplete. The evidence from the lake floors, from the oral traditions, from the geological anomalies, from the ancient mining records, all of it points toward a history that is older and more complex than conventional story allows. A history that includes, or may include, underground structures of considerable age and considerable sophistication, built by people who have not yet been given their proper place in our understanding of this continent. Getting that history right, investigating the mystery seriously, finding what is actually down there in the cold, dark water, would not diminish the conventional story of North American prehistory. It would expand it. It would add depth and complexity in years, possibly thousands of years, to a story that is already remarkable. It would give the people whose ancestors built those things their full due in the story of human civilization on this planet. That is worth doing. That is worth the cost and the difficulty and the political complexity and the institutional inertia. The Great Lakes are not going anywhere. The cold is not getting warmer fast enough to change what is down there in the next generation. There's still time to go looking properly. Whether anyone will, that is the question that the mystery ultimately leaves us with. Not what is down there, but whether we have the will and the wisdom to find it on behalf of all the people who put it there, and all the people who came after them, and all the people who are still, in some deep and almost wordless sense, waiting for the story to be told completely. The water keeps the secret for now, as it has in the dark for 10,000 years, and the mystery endures. There are people right now who know more about this than has been written here. Retired geologists with field notebooks full of anomalous observations that never made it into peer-reviewed papers. Elderly members of indigenous communities who carry knowledge about specific underground places that their grandparents taught them and that will go with them when they go. Divers with GPS coordinates and underwater photographs stored on hard drives in garages and spare bedrooms, waiting for someone with institutional resources to ask the right questions. Amateur archaeologists with databases of surface finds that point toward underground features no one has followed up, Mining engineers whose great-grandparents worked at Keweenaw, and whose family stories include things that do not fit the official account. All of that knowledge exists. It is scattered, fragmented, poorly documented, and under-resourced. But it exists. And the mystery it points toward is real enough that eventually, whether in our generation or the next or the one after that, someone is going to take it seriously enough to go find out what is actually down there. When that happens, the world's understanding of who lived on this continent and for how long and what they built will change. Not in the way that fringe theory has always promised it would change, with ancient aliens and lost continents and secret bloodlines, but in the much more interesting way that actual history changes when actual evidence is actually investigated, by becoming richer, older, and more genuinely human than we imagined. The cold water waits, and so does the answer. The divers who keep going back season after season to the same coordinates in the cold northern lakes are not cranks. They are not conspiracy theorists. They are people who have seen something that does not fit the standard explanation and who cannot stop thinking about what it means. That kind of persistent attention applied to anomalies that cannot be explained away is how science has always moved forward, not through the smooth operation of established consensus, but through the refusal of individuals to stop asking questions a consensus has not answered. The Great Lakes deserve those questions. The mystery deserves that attention. And the civilization or civilizations that may have built those passages in the deep, dark rock beneath the lakes deserves to be found, named, understood, and given its proper place in the long story of human beings on this earth. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.